Ladies and gentlemen, people of all gender expressions, thank you for checking out the North Bank Media Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Strevens, and it's that time again. I've clicked over into a new set of digits. We're on episode number 51, and as is tradition, I'm doing a solo episode to, work out some ideas. I just want to take a quick minute to say that you may remember on January 28th, I went out and did a mooncast out in the River Valley with my good friend Devin Bailey. That was the anniversary, the 10-year anniversary of the passing of our friend Jeff Chrzanecki. Today is July 28th, so 7 months later, and this would have been his birthday, his 32nd birthday, I suppose. So I just wanted to take a minute and dedicate this episode to him, ironically, because I'm now about to ramble for half an hour or more about some ideas that are pretty half-baked, and he didn't have a ton of patience for that. I remember him once saying, just take a minute before you talk, because sometimes you sound real baked. I'm not baked. I don't do that anymore. But he was my best friend, and being out in the River Valley all year round is where I can connect with him, even though he's in some senses long gone. But at the same time, he is down here, and I thought about this a lot back a couple winters ago. It's interesting how a space and a ritual, you're in a place doing the things you used to do with somebody, but they're not there. But in a sense, they are. And maybe that's an idea I can expand upon in a later episode, but I wanted to dedicate this episode to the memory of my friend Jeff Chrzanecki. I'm going to do my best to work out an idea here that's something like building on what I talked about in the previous episode about this idea of living in God. Now, what that means to me is a striving for the ideal. I'm not talking about God as a creator. I'm talking about God as the highest good that you can conceive of. And the process of expressing yourself as purely as possible and striving for those ideals, or that ideal proper, that to me is something like living in God. That's living in the presence of the Lord. I'm not sure how useful any of this is to anybody, but if you're looking for some sense of clarity or some sense of self, or a why and a how to live your life as I was, this is sort of the method that I undertook. So with that said, I'm going to try and lay out some ideas here. I really appreciate anybody who's listening. Again, the invitation to be a guest on this show or to contribute in any way is open. Please, you can get in touch with me. North Bank Media Podcast. We're now on Instagram. Should say we're also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, everywhere you get your podcast. Leave a YouTube comment. Hit me up on Instagram. You can email Patrick at North Bank Media. Any support or any listening to this podcast is appreciated. It's I've said before, it's not for the audience, and in some senses that's true. But as you might find out as I go along with these ideas, the idea of a collective, a group, a tribe rallying around some sense of an ideal or an idea is maybe very important, more important than I realized. I find it really interesting when ideas present themselves to me, when the same idea sort of presents itself to me in multiple ways. And that always piques my interest. So that happened over the last month or two, and I wanted to start there. I think it's not where I'm going to finish necessarily, but I think it'll be a good jumping off point. This is the idea of collectivism versus individualism. Now, I'm sure there's, sociological, anthropological, descriptions of collectivism, and I'm probably going to run roughshod all over them and just come up with my own ideas. So maybe collectivism isn't even the right word, but it's something like the group versus the individual. Now, if you've listened to this show for any amount of time, you know that I'm pretty in favor of personal responsibility and of putting the onus for really anything onto the individual. I think a lot of the ills in society, a lot of the problems that we see day to day are those problems that occur within the individual at first, and then sort of, metastasize or sort of, I guess, play out at scale or within the aggregate, across society in trends, if you know what I mean. I think you may say there are structural issues, personal issues. I think you may see there's structural issues, there's systemic issues. I think that's all true, but I think on some level they start at the level of the individual. So this idea of a collective it first occurred to me we've all heard the cliche, if you want to go far, go together. If you want to go fast, go alone. And so I've been thinking, I've definitely been going fast in some ways and doing a lot of personal work. Getting fucking eaten by red ants here. I picked a great spot. Hey, we're live on the north bank of the river, though. That's what it's all about, folks. I've done a lot of personal work, but I haven't done a lot of work as far as, building a team or building any kind of collective or tribe around me. I'm not a natural born leader, I don't think. And so it's fascinating to me to think, well, I've done all this work individually, personally, especially during the pandemic, but not so much as far as building any kind of collective, or am I doing enough to reach out to my friends, to my colleagues, to my family? I'm not sure. In some ways I'm a very self-centered, self-indulgent, self-involved person. But I was at a Amway meeting, and I wasn't buying, I was actually shooting video. And I don't know anything about Amway or World Financial Group. The people there were very nice to me. They treated me well. They paid fairly. And that's all I have to say about that. But it occurred to me in listening to them talk for 12 hours that that's very much a collectivist sort of a setup, right? It's very much a in the model of almost like a church, where there's leaders, and then there's tiers of leaders, and then there's sort of the pawns or the peons or the people on the up and coming who sort of contribute to the wealth and to the cash and the status of the leaders, and a lot of those people seem very satisfied. I mean, a lot of them were ruined by debt, by addiction, and a lot of that, what goes into World Financial Group or Amway is a lifestyle change. It's not just about the money or the product. It's about a way of life. And so that's a collective that rallies around a way of life. And it kind of hit me then. It was like, well, it's easy for me to sit here and judge if I want to, but also it's like, what have I done to uplift others? What have I done to build a collective, to give people something to rally around? I don't know that I really have done any of that. I have to be quite honest in saying that my upbringing was very privileged. My parents made it so that, I was debt free, and that I could, I had a free ride through university, and then stumbled into a good job and a good career that I've pursued. But I did so because I really had very little debt and very little, really nothing but opportunity and support and a safety net to do that. The reason I bring that up is because that set me out. I felt as though in some ways I was the individual. I did this for myself. There was no collective that uplifted me, beyond my parents. So I realize that's a sort of a selfish and self-centered way to look at it, but I've been made no bones about that being kind of the way I am. So then over the years to develop this philosophy or to at least believe in a philosophy of personal responsibility, I think that's part and parcel of being sort of an individualist. I'm not a renegade or a rogue or a rebel, but just someone who sort of does their best to stand on their own. And I mean, my job description as a freelancer is very much tied to that. It's like I show up, on a job site for a small amount of time. I become a part of the team just briefly or not even, and I'm in and I'm out. I come in to help like a hired gun almost. So, and I do like that. But then I think, well, really, if I wanted to uplift myself, if I really wanted to make something of myself, I think I have to rally around a collective. I have to be a part of a real team, a team that's cohesive and pulls together for the long run. And, so it was with that in mind, I then I sat down with my friend Faisal Jan Mohammed on an earlier episode of this podcast, and he's a pretty liberal guy, progressive thinker. I mean, I guess he's a member of what he calls or he would consider to be the scumbag left, right? So that's, you see that liberal compassion, that progressive ideal, but you also see a lot of disdain for other schools of thought. So which I have no problem with. I mean, I think a lot of it is disdainful. All of what goes on in this life, much of it is disdainful. I have no problem with disdain. but he was a big proponent of this idea of the collective. And he said to me, he was like, well, the ills of the individual are solved by the collective. And I thought, shit, that's exactly the opposite of what I thought. And yet I could agree, It's like, I mean, and I suppose too, that's part of why this podcast started. It was like an individual problem. I don't know what the hell I'm talking about or what I'm thinking. So I figured I'd ask some other people, and in that way we could come up with something that maybe made sense, and maybe solve some problems, mine or otherwise. Just watching these ducks go across the water, man. Beautiful day out here. Wednesday night, July 28th. Kind of a hazy sunset. I'd say take a moment and just appreciate being alive, honestly. Like, if you're listening to this podcast, thank you. But, really, just take a moment to just appreciate being alive. Because it is finite. And it won't be forever. And the baby ducks are going on the mother duck's back. How's that for collective? So, what Faisal was talking about, the problems of the individual being solved by the collective, I mean, that's fundamentally a pretty liberal, I would say, idea, It requires the flow of information. It requires the gathering of people across different class, race, any identitarian lines need to be crossed in order to form a collective that would properly uplift people, I think. And then in a later episode of the podcast that will come out after this one, I spoke with Dr. Arsh Kaira, and he was a very liberal guy too. I mean, he even made some allusions to being somewhat Marxist. So did I, but that was a joke, by the way. If you're listening to that, I jokingly said I'm becoming Marxist through doing this podcast, but I think that's an allusion to what I'm talking about here. Is I'm gradually realizing the need for a collective. The way in which people. If any one person wished to be uplifted or to improve upon themselves, it may require a group. That old cliche, and I go back to cliches, but they hang in for a reason. It's like that old cliche that it takes a village to raise a child. Well, maybe it takes a collective to raise up a person. I'm totally open to that. So when that idea struck me, it was like, damn, it requires deep introspection to I guess to say, well, the way I've been thinking has got me to where I am, and I'm not necessarily where I want to be, so I have to entertain some opposing ideas. So that's about as far as I've gotten with that. I'm definitely going to start talking to guests about that idea of the collective, and could the problems of the individual in fact be solved by the collective in some senses or in some ways. I'm not sure, but when we talk about, when I talk about at least this personal work that I've done during the pandemic, that's the work of an individual is on the self, right? Maybe in some ways, given what I just said, maybe the only work that an individual can do is on the self. And so, that's been a big part of the last 18 months for me, discipline, scheduling, nutrition, sleep, regimenting my life, making good choices, ultimately maintaining my energy, not giving my energy away, working on some addictions, being there for the people that need me. And there you go. That's ultimately where I think it gets you, is you work on yourself as best you can, and then maybe you can reach out and be a support to one other person, two other people. And in a certain amount of time, then you could build a collective, right? I think that's the idea. But I wasn't doing it with that. I was really doing it because I would go insane. I would go crazy. I always functioned well during the school year, the hockey season, really that's it, the university season, when I had structure, when I had goals to check off. And then you go into a life of a relative freedom. I mean, it's right in the name, freelancing, right? And suddenly, you're responsible for putting the blinders on yourself when necessary, for keeping yourself on track when necessary. So I really, the mantra I've been using is routinize and scrutinize, routinize and scrutinize. And you can feel free to use that. I'm not sure why you would, but you sure can. Get yourself into a routine, and then to constantly be asking yourself, am I improving? Is this the right routine? And checking in with yourself on a hour to hour, minute to minute, surely day to day basis. Now, routinize and scrutinize, that's that's really made the difference for me, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. Somewhat selfishly and naively, in the months leading up to the pandemic, I'm talking, December, January, February 2020, I was searching for a why, and I was in the process of revamping my business, that's North Bank Media, branding myself, and that was kind of what concerned me. And it's funny that I was really starting to delve into that, and then when things shifted, I kind of got away with it, or got away from it, and then in some ways rediscovered it in another way. And I hope to touch on all that, and I hope people will find it interesting. A friend of mine, he said he's looking for some clarity in his life, and I'm really trying to get away from preaching to people. I'm really trying to get away from giving unsolicited advice or bad advice, or just advice that's really any advice is bad advice, I think, in some ways, because you're just coming from your point of view and it doesn't apply to another person's. But I suppose the best I could say is, if you are looking for some sense of self or routine or clarity or self-improvement, then this is at least what I did. Maybe it's worth thinking about. At least I'm going to think about it now verbally, and if it's of any use to anybody, I think that'd be the best I could hope for. So, like I said, I was searching for a why, and that's a pretty big question, obviously, but you need a why, I think, especially when I'm talking specifically about starting a brand, starting a business, starting a video production or a media company. And there's that word company. That's a collective. Ultimately, I knew even then that it needed to be a collective, but it started with me. And so I spoke with a gentleman that I was privileged to know. I haven't talked to him lately, Luc Bouchard. He was on an early episode of this podcast. I should actually get him back on the show and see how he's doing. Hell of a guy, Luc Bouchard. But he always told me, if you think you have something to offer the world, then get your head out of your ass and offer it. And what that meant to me is that it's very easy to get bogged down in yourself, right? And I've said I'm self-indulgent, self-defeating, self-repressed, self-oppressed, whatever you want to say. There's a million reasons not to put yourself out there, but the thing is, everybody has something to offer. And Luke taught me that I have something to offer, and that I need to go about offering it to people, because I can help, I can make a difference, so I need to do that. So then I'm searching for a why. It's like, well, why would I do something like that? And to me, that's it. It's like, you can help, you can provide value, you can build a collective, you can help people achieve their goals. You have something that nobody else has. You're you. And so when I was searching for that why, it occurred to me that the why would I do that? It's because there's really nothing else that you can do, right? Because if you don't do that, if you don't express yourself, well, what are you doing? Right? Like, you're not living in some sense if you're not making your mark on the world. And again, I'm going to start making assertions and prioritizing things, and I think at some point you have to. I like to speak broadly, but I would have to put my foot down on that and say, it's incumbent upon a person to give what they can and to express themselves. And the truer that expression is, the purer it is, the closer to the heart that it is, the most like you that it is, the most uniquely personal it is, the more effective it is. Okay? The more pure that expression of yourself is, the more effective it is, the more it resonates. I think about that quote from jazz pianist Chick Corea. And hey, Mike Fian, if you're listening, do you remember the Chick Corea concert? Because I sure don't. But we were there, man. We were there, dude. He said, be yourself. Chick Corea said, be yourself, because the more like yourself you are, the more money you make. So what does that mean? What does that mean? It's not about the money necessarily, is it? No, it means that the more like yourself you are, the more value you have to offer. The more of a niche you can hone and craft for yourself, the deeper you can go, the more you can give. The more you can give, and the more you can get back. The more value you can provide, because you went and did something that nobody else can do. And I don't want to take the discussion too far away from where I'm at, but this idea of intersectionality, where and I heard Jordan Peterson say the true intersectional being is the individual. And I've said that to a few people who are progressive thinkers, and they, I think, would have to agree. It's like, you can keep slicing up the intersection until you come up with the individual. And I think that's what this is talking about. It's like, you have to give all of yourself and find exactly who you are, and then you can receive back the most value by giving the most unique and the most sort of needed, really the most, there's nothing like you. So you have to give yourself to the world, because the world doesn't have you if you don't give yourself to the world. Okay, have I made the point yet? So, as much as I talk about the path of least resistance to the self, or how we do one thing is how we do all things, or the way that what we do, what we choose to do, whatever flows naturally. I mean, that's a pretty pure expression, As much as I talk about that, that really doesn't mean I know what I'm talking about. I'm just working on ideas here. I have to be honest about that. I don't have any insight about this beyond my experience. So I would advocate, at least, or what I've tried to do, is do what comes naturally. Let flow what flows. So when I was starting a brand or a business, I mean, that's what I was initially supposed to do. When you do that, you're really starting a process of introspection and self-actualization, whether you realize it or not. If you're trying to make a personal brand or start a company that's based on your values, you're actually doing a process of self-discovery. You have to know what your values are before you build a company around it. Before you start going out into the world and telling people this is what's important. How do you know what's important, right? If you don't know what's important to you. And so, it's thoughts like this is why I was so, I guess, far removed from the idea of the collective, when to me the collective stems from the individual. But it could be that they're mutually exclusive or hydraulic, in the sense that they sort of flow and transfer back and forth. So as I was searching for this why, I will say that at this point I took a pretty heavy dose of marijuana, and I'll be honest, marijuana is something that I would say damn near ruined my life in some ways, or it was part of a set of habits that I was allowing to damn near ruin my life. It's been over a year since I've smoked marijuana. It's been the better part of a year since I've touched it at all. But I would say that this, what followed in my search for why, was maybe my last great weed-fueled creative expression. So the question then, as I said, became, well, why am I? And this is what I landed on. I landed on the idea of time, and in some sense space, but time and space. Okay, time is infinite. For the purposes of this thought experiment, time is infinite. But the amount of time that I am conscious or alive is finite. Okay? Remember that old axe or that old saw about what would an infinite, all-knowing, all-seeing God desire? What would an infinite God desire? To be finite. And that's what it is to be human. I exist because I won't exist eventually, and I didn't exist before. I'm fleeting, I'm intransient, I'm impermanent. I exist because in the infinite river, I am. Within the infinite flow of time, a small slice of time exists within me, or I exist within it. So, with that in mind, I reasoned that time is the number one resource. And I wrote on my whiteboard, well, what the are you going to do with your time, son? What are you going to do with your time? So if time is the be-all and end-all, and it is in this case, it is then the basic structure or the basic principle that structures this self-exploration. Okay, so time is sort of the absolute here. And I use time as the sort of scheduling or structuring principle. So if time is infinite and I'm not, I reason that I have to leverage that time into tangible results. Okay, I've been given a piece of the most purest infinite thing, time. And if I want anything out of this life, I have to use that time. I have to put that time in. Now this to me is akin to how man, woman, anybody, doesn't matter your gender or gender expression, how any person shapes their reality through time. Whatever it is to you is what it is. Whatever it is, and I mean like existence, being, the am. Whatever that is to you, that's what it is. You have to remember that. Or I should say, you don't have to do anything. This is how I think. Right? Reality is shaped by you. Any sort of metaphysical truth handed down from on high or from above, unlikely. Whatever it is, however you perceive it, however you shape it, that's what it is. Now, I understand, obviously, I'm making some assertions about what to prioritize and what to value, but, I think at some point, you really have to. I think as little as much wishy-washiness as I've done on this podcast, and as much or as little as I've stood on anything, that's kind of where I'm at. An objective, rational truth coming down from outside the human consciousness, I think, is unlikely. I would love to be proven wrong, but I'm operating as if it weren't the case. So in 2013, I was finishing up my studies at the University of Alberta, and the professor and most of the other kids in the class read Sartre and Heidegger and Nietzsche, and I don't know if I could even be bothered. I tried Kierkegaard. I wasn't a great student, but we ended the course, and this was the genius of this woman, Professor Morin. I think she was Swiss. I can still hear her voice. I can still hear her voice coming out of my mouth, drunk, walking home from the bus stop at like 1 a.m. I'm not going to do it now. I have too much respect for her, and not enough for myself, I guess. But she ended the course on the French writer Albert Camus, and I know I've talked about him on this podcast before. And she introduced me to his theory of the absurd. Camus talked about philosophical suicide, and I talked about it last time on the podcast, and I am in danger of it here again, to suppose a totalizing meaning of life, so I really have to be careful here. I'm not doing that. Again, whatever it is for me is what it is for me, and I cannot impose that on anybody. Philosophical suicide for Camus was to oppose a rational, metaphysical truth outside of the human consciousness, to suppose that there was a rational meaning for life, a totalizing view of life. But that's not the difference. I'm deciding how to live my life, period. And so for Camus, there was 3 things that came from this. This feeling of the absurd, okay? There was 3 things that stemmed from the absurd. Now, the absurd here is the idea that, okay, if we accept that there is no totalizing rational view of life, then life is absurd. And when we realize that our mind, suppose there was a totalizing rational meaning of life, suppose there was, our mind could never perceive it. This search for meaning in a chaotic universe leads to the feeling of the absurd. And it can sometimes smack us right square in the face. So 3 things stem from that. First, revolt. Okay, so if there is no total rational meaning of life, if life is meaningless ultimately beyond whatever meaning I put on it, we have to ask ourselves, well then, is life worth living? Now, for Camus, he says famously in the opening lines of his book, The Myth of Sisyphus, the only philosophical question is suicide. So if life is meaningless, is it worth living? To revolt or to commit the ultimate revolutionary act is to live, is to decide that life is worth living. Following this revolution, this revolt, this act of revolt, comes your freedom. No one can impose meaning on me. I impose all meaning on myself. And following that, passion. If I decide that life is worth living, and if I decide what life means to me, what follows then has to be passion. I must live every moment to the fullest. So what I'm actually thinking of doing is getting a plaque on my wall. Sometimes you go to people's houses and they have a little wooden plaque up by the door or over the fireplace that says "Live, laugh, love," or "This house is full of." Fuck! I'm getting bitten by red ants here. Christ's sakes. Or they have one of those little wooden plaques that says, "This house is full of 2 alcoholics who drink a lot of wine and hang out with their dogs," or whatever. I'm not judging. Sometimes I wish I had a dog, but I'm gonna get a plaque that says "Revolt, Freedom, Passion," and then instead of like a French bulldog drinking wine, it's like it's Sisyphus rolling his rock up the hill. So when I think about that in terms of what I've been thinking about, jamming some thoughts together in my head, I start to notice a binary here. There's there's this feeling of the absurd, right? There's the infinite chaotic universe, and then there's the very limited, the very ordered, or the very order-seeking human mind. There's the infinite versus the finite. And so I think what comes out of a lot of this is this existential dread, this horror in some sense of we have to decide what life means to us, and we have to compete with the fact that life doesn't last forever. And I think one way that humans do that, obviously, is through media and through memory for sure, but through media, right? Recording, just like this, film, photography, sculptures, painting. Something where we can take a piece of what we are, what's important to us, and push it into infinity, freeze it, and leave it forever. Now this started with me trying to found a brand, trying to start a company. I wanted to help people, really. I wanted to get paid. I wanted to do what I love. I never wanted to work a 9 to 5 again. I mean, those were kind of the concrete goals. So I reasoned ultimately that I needed to set goals. It became clear that like you don't get to the top of the mountain in one step, obviously. And so what I guess I would say is if you're looking for any sense of clarity or sense of self, what worked for me was setting goals first and foremost. And you know what? There's a lot that goes into, well, what goals should I set or what's important? And I can't profess to tell you that, but I guess I would just remind you that, remember, life is short. You should live every moment to the fullest as much as possible. You're deciding that life means something to you. So then pursue what it is that contributes to that meaning. You haven't killed yourself. So clearly you're deciding that life is worth living. Well, what do you want to do with that life? Think about it. I think it's in there. I think it's in everybody. Goal setting is all fine and good, but again, if we're thinking about this temporal structure that I was talking about before, the fact that I exist within this piece of time, I think that goal setting is important, but goals exist in the future. And goals are very much static in some sense. They're a static conceptualization, meaning it's a place in the future that I go and I check the box, I turn the switch, did I do it? Yes, no, on, off, right? And they're very necessary. You need those small achievable steps. You need those small achievable steps. But if we're only projecting into the future, then we're fucked, right? We can't just blast off into outer space in a dick-shaped rocket without knowing how we got to the launch pad. With all due respect to Jeff Bezos. Think about this. If you're deciding that life means something, if you're deciding to live, and we're understanding that time is what you've been given to live with, then you can exist within that time however you want. You can see yourself in that time however you want. Okay, and time exists in multiple planes, right? We know that because we can set goals. We know that because we're going to die, right? We know that because I have to do something tomorrow. We know that I have to eventually get married. Eventually, I have to buy a house. Eventually, I'm going to have to buy a new car. I'm going to have to buy a new camera. Eventually, I'm going to have to talk to my friend about that thing that I've been meaning to tell them for years. Right? We know that the future is coming, and we live like the future is coming. But equally so too does the past. And we can get hung up on the past just as easy. So think about that. We, in some sense, exist on multiple planes of time. Maybe you might say, well, physically, I'm only ever in the present. It's like, okay. But think how much time you spend thinking about where you're going to be tomorrow. Where am I going to be tomorrow? Where am I going to be that's not here? Why did I do that yesterday? Why did I do that last year? Why did I do that when I was a kid? You couldn't talk about physical presence, but if your mind is projecting or casting back into the past or projecting forward into the future, you tell me where you are. Tell me where you are when you're dreaming. So what I reasoned was like, okay, goals are great, but goals are static. Goals are like steps. But what's a long line of steps? How do I take these steps? Well, what I began to think was I needed a process. Okay, so I've settled on a why. I've settled on a why. I asked myself why. I asked myself, why am I? And I landed on the fact that, okay, I am only because I have been, I have also not been, I will be, and I also will not be. Meaning, I am a finite popcorn kernel that just came and I'll go. That's why I exist. Because in the infinite stretches of time, I got a little slice of it just for me. But in that slice of time, it's not just the present. Like I said, like I've been saying, there's the future. There's the past. And there's within there's layers and levels to the future. 10 years, 1 year, 1 second. Right? It's a process. It's a process that unites us across time. The process of being. Okay, so at this point I sort of modulated away from the how. At this point I modulated away from the why into the how. How am I? How should I be? And I don't like the word should. So if the question first was why am I? The question is now, how am I? What is the process? So, goals, like I've been saying, exist in the future, and I conceive of them in the present. But the how do I get from here to the present? Well, that's guided by a process. Again, I have to ground it here so that people don't completely lose me if they haven't already. All this started with me ultimately searching for meaning and a reason to be. Where do I fit in this crazy, chaotic world? Okay, fine, the world is chaos. I'm responsible for ordering it as best I can. So I need a way to live. I can think of things to do, but I need a way to do them. I need a way to live. And it's funny, but I think about this lyric from Steve Winwood and Eric Clapton when they were together in a group called Blind Faith. And he says, I have finally found a way to live, just like I never could before. I have finally found a way to live in the presence of the Lord. Now, what this really makes me think about is what I spoke about in a previous episode, this idea of living in God, right? And that's the purest expression of myself that I can manage. And you know when you're expressing yourself properly, and you know when you're not, right? When you're not, your mood suffers, the people around you suffer, you aren't setting goals, you're certainly not reaching goals, your discipline falls away, bad choices happen, you're not taking care of yourself. But when you are living in God, when you are in the presence of the Lord, and I don't mean this in a religious sense, but I mean this in that you're actively searching for the highest ideal that you can imagine, and you're striving towards it. So this ultimately what this is a process of me delving into what God might be, and I didn't realize it initially, but when I ironically when I got to that song lyric, and then I thought of the Van Morrison lyric, when will I ever learn to live in God? And then the way to live is in the presence of the Lord. Well, it all started to make sense. This is ultimately starting a brand, starting a company, doing any form of pure expression is delving into what God means to you. It's incumbent upon you. Okay, I'm assuming this is true. It's incumbent upon you to express yourself on the world in some way or another. It's also incumbent on you to realize that time is limited for you. You have to make meaning. You have to do with your time what you will, and you should probably, hate that word should. You have to do what you will with your time, and you need to use that time to express yourself upon the world, to make a statement, and to maybe, that little piece of you, that finite piece of you could possibly reach infinity. That's what striving for God is. Now, I need to be careful here that I don't run afoul of the idea of shirk. That's an Islamic concept. I don't pretend to know really anything about Islam. It's something that my friend Devin Bailey had mentioned to me in passing. We're both sort of leery of saying anything about it because we don't know. But as I understand it, it's this idea of worshiping a false god. But I'm not talking about being God or worshiping a god. I'm not saying time is God. I'm not saying I'm God. I'm saying that I can live in God. I can strive to be with God and within God and have God within me when I strive to express myself as purely as possible and to understand myself as purely as possible. Now, there's levels to this process, right? This process is an ongoing, potentially infinite thing that may just run through me and then continue running through somebody else. It's dictated by time again, right? In the present, we be. The grammar's right there. In the present, we be. We exist. We just are, right? You perceive this tiny little slice of infinite time. Okay, big deal. I think we've made our point. But also, in the present is where first order presences exist. Also in the present is where first order processes exist. I mean being. The process begins in the present and extends out from here. Myself. It exists here. And how I be myself exists here. Okay? I be in the present, but also I be myself in the present, meaning self-care, routine, basic needs, desires, thoughts, feelings, stimuli, blood, guts, flesh, hormones. I be and I self in the future. Okay, we're finally, I've got written here, okay, good, we're finally getting to something that makes sense. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if any of this makes sense, but I hope maybe in some ways it's making sense to somebody. Now, within the present tense, I can project forward by setting goals. Now, we know that. We've been saying that. But I can also exist in the past. Okay? We spent a lot of time talking about the present. I think I need to hammer this home again. In the present is where we be. Okay? The process originates in the presence. How to be begins there and extends forward into the future and back into the past. Within the present tense, I project forward by setting goals. I can also exist in the past. How? Journaling. Okay, I need to pause here and say something about journaling. If there is one thing in my life that I have done that has improved things remarkably, that has improved things without question, it is journaling. Okay? In September of 2018, I started keeping a journal, 1 page per day. That's all it needs to be. It may only be a few hundred words a day. Just write about what the day was. And track the metrics. How was the weather? How did you sleep? How did you eat? Did you work out? Who did you see? Did you have a meaningful conversation or not? Did somebody cut you off and you really lost your goddamn mind? Did somebody make kind of a underhanded, passive-aggressive comment that really cheesed you off? Did you have a nice interaction with somebody out in public? Did you feel some sexual attraction to somebody? Did you have a nice home-cooked meal with your parents? Write about it. Why wouldn't you want to remember that? But not only do you get to make sense of your day, you then have the benefit of being able to read about that day again forever. Now, to some people that might sound like hell, and that is fair. But I'm telling you, if you journal for 60 days, 1 page per day, I don't know when it is, before you go to bed at night, when you wake up in the morning, at your lunch break, whatever works for you. I like to do it in the morning. Write about what happened the day before. Now, you may say, well, wouldn't it make more sense to write about the day at the end of the day after you... Yes, possibly. Although I think there's something to be said for sleeping on the day and then summing it up later. Although there's lenses that you put on it either way. Do that for 60 days, okay? And then go back and read your life like a book. And I guarantee you, you will weep. Or at least you will want to change. Or maybe you'll feel really great and have a good sense of where you are. I hope for all of those for you. To me, journaling is really the past participle of goal setting. We all know about the weather forecast. We all check the weather forecast. But lesser known and kind of more for aviation is the weather report. Well, how was the weather yesterday? Now, if you knew how the weather was for a year leading up to today, and you could read the forecast for the next 2 weeks, you might be able to then project the next 2 weeks, the next 2 weeks, the next 2 weeks, because you had the report from last year. What I'm trying to get at here is that if the universe is ultimately chaotic, and our mind seeks to order it, and time is all we've got to structure this sense of order, you need to create some form of temporal stability. You need to exist across multiple planes of time equally, okay? And that's what journaling and goal setting allow you to do. Now, if you're looking for some kind of clarity, some kind of sense of self or direction, this is as much advice as I could ever give anybody. Create temporal stability. Set goals and decide where you want to be in the future. Where do you want to be tomorrow? Where do you want to be at the end of the month? Where do you want to be in 1 year? Where do you want to be in 5 years? Where do you want to be in 10 years? Where do you want to be when you're on your deathbed? What do you want to have accomplished with your life? Similarly, once you've done anything, record it and then be very, very honest, because the numbers don't lie. Are you sleeping enough? Are you drinking enough water? Are you getting out? Are you getting out too much? Are you spending too much money? Are you not spending enough money? Are you spending money on the wrong things? Are you hanging out with the wrong people? Are you drinking too much? Are you drinking too much? Are you smoking too much weed? Are you smoking too much crack? All possible. All possible. Are you eating too much soybean oil? How's your acne? How's your skin? How's your toenails? How's your fingernails? I'm really serious about this. Plenty of people, I don't mean to pass a moral judgment, but if ever anybody says to me, well, they have some struggle or some personal problem, I could only ever advocate keeping a journal. Because it's like, well, how long has the struggle been going on? Has it been going on for a day, a year, a week, a month? And what's the problem? Is it getting better? Are you even trying? Do you know what the problem is? And then your goal setting can stem from there. It's like, well, you know what? I journaled for 60 days and I found out that I was drinking every other day and jerking off. And then I would get tired after dinner and make nothing of the evening. Mentioning no names. Well, then it becomes very obvious. It's like, well, shit, I'm doing things that are really cratering my energy and cratering my digestive system. And whatever goes into your body, that's your fuel. And if you're fueling yourself with I could go on. It doesn't really matter. You know what I'm getting at. What then comes from this temporal stability is a rate of productivity. I'm sure you know the metric I'm going to use for productivity involves time. It's growth over time. How many goals did you achieve this year? How many workouts? How many days of adequate hydration? How many pages written? How many pages read? How many meaningful conversations? How many things were you grateful for? And were you doing any more or less of those now than you were 60 days ago? Well, you can track that progress and that productivity. Again, when I set out, I'm sitting out by the river, and when I set out to start a company or a brand or to undertake this process of self-discovery and find out what is important to me in this insane world, this is what comes to mind. Once you realize how little you're truly doing, then you can realize how much you could actually do. And that's the power of time. There's no way to get a better sense of yourself than to see yourself across time. And so any task, any goal, it's there by us. It's a small static building block, but it's also part of a necessary ongoing continuation of who you are, shaping your reality. Anyway, these are just the ramblings of a mental man, as Ricky Gervais once said, describing Carl Pilkington's movie pitch. But I do appreciate anyone that's listening to these episodes. I've got some real exciting episodes coming up, I think. As I said, Dr. Arsh Khaira was a great guest. That episode will be out right away. Talked to a few people that are running in Edmonton's upcoming fall election. Got Sam Reed coming on to talk some more filmmaking. We're going to talk about Bo Burnham's comedy special Inside, which is a triumph in my mind as a creative and as a video person. Definitely worth checking out on Netflix. So I hope everyone's having a great summer. North Bank Media Podcast is still endeavoring to get to 100 episodes by the end of the calendar year. So we've got our work cut out for us. If you or anyone you know would like to be a guest on a podcast, this is the opportunity. So please get in touch with me on Instagram, North Bank Media Podcast. Drop a YouTube comment. You can email me, patrick@northbankmedia.com. I would love to hear from you. Anyway, hope you're having a great summer. Hope you're taking time to find that temporal stability, past, present, and future. And all the best. Thank you for listening. Onward.